Hello students, the purpose of this video is exclusively to help you understand how each one of you approached the diagrammatic models that were required as part of assignment number 1 for the class here. So I'm going to use some of your own examples. I'll just call you by first name. I hope you're not offended. I didn't actually ask permission to see if I could use your assignments, but each one of you that are mentioned in this video gave me a reason to explain a certain kind of a model. So let's get started. I'm going to start, if I look down, it's because I've got my papers down here for your assignments. I want to start with this model, which is my favorite. I will build off this model. You'll see it in the exams, and it's an important model because what it allows you to do as students is to build on the idea that X is correlated to Y. Somehow, some way, X is correlated to Y. We're not saying X causes Y, but that's what this arrow means. This arrow means that X is somehow correlated to Y. Y being the dependent variable and X being the independent variable. But here I've got variable number 1, variable number 2, and variable number 3. In this model here, these are intervening variables. They do not directly correlate to the dependent variable. What they do is they correlate to the relationship that the independent variable has to the dependent variable. And I'm going to show you why that's important and why we need to look at and distinguish in very important ways what an intervening variable is. So when you see this in various references that I make throughout the semester, you'll see me refer to as x1, x2, x3. So this is, when you see a direct arrow, you know that it is an independent variable relationship with the dependent variable. When you see an arrow into the relationship that x1 and y have, you'll know that it's an intervening variable. So I call these x2 and x3. So throughout these models, I want you to think about this as the starting point. And we're going to talk about several variations on how this can be adapted to each one of your equations. So let's start with, this one is Natasha's. Natasha was doing, for her dependent variable, she had the fact that she found a story that the teen birth rate in the United States has dropped. And she complicated this, Natasha, you complicated this by saying it was for non-Hispanics, Hispanics, and Caucasians, white individuals as well. And so that's your population, which is very, very important, because as you can see by this slide here, when you're thinking of the variables, these are questions that you need to ask when you're building your model and you're diagramming the relationships within the model. Do you have more than one dependent variable? If you do, you're going to have to modify that. So what you did, Natasha, was you said, oh, okay, the drop in U.S. teen birth rates was dropping for Hispanics, non-Hispanics, and Caucasians. So you clarified that and you said this is all teens, but you could narrow that down further by studying just Hispanics, non-Hispanics, blacks, whites, or you could do urban and rural. So there is another way to define and restrict and focus your research by focusing on this dependent variable. But so you need to ask yourself, do you have more than one dependent variable, or, and alternatively, is your dependent variable too broad? What is your population of interest? That is related to what Natasha said here about analyzing subpopulations. Can you pinpoint a unit of analysis? Well, obviously we're talking about female teenagers in the United States. So that is your unit of analysis, so you've pinpointed that very well. How will you operationalize this? Now this is where it gets complicated, because Natasha, in your example, you talked about better sex education, you talked about access to contraception, you talked about focusing on programs that work, you talked about focusing on a cultural trend for teenagers to be more careful and then talk to each other, and parental influence. So you've named a whole bunch of relationships. So now what we need to look at is, the way you diagrammed it was that you diagrammed it as x1, x2, and x3 all having a direct relationship to the dependent variable of a dropping teen birth rate in the United States. And so what you need to look at is ask yourself, is contraception alone directly related to availability of contraception? Is it directly related to the drop in teen birth rates? Or would it be more appropriate to think of the dropping teen birth rate as impacting the as an intervening variable. So if you look at x2 as an independent variable, it means it has a direct relationship. If you look at it as an intervening variable, what it means is that sex education coupled with the availability of contraceptions has probably a better, is probably a better way of diagramming this model. Because contraception and the availability of contraceptives by itself is not going to do much unless there is better sex education that actually talks about using contraceptives. So I would argue that the access to more contraception is an intervening variable as part of better sex education. Parental influence, now we could also argue that parental influence is a direct relationship, but it also could argue, and it depends on how you want to model your research program, if you're talking about sex education and you're talking about getting parents involved during that period of time when the teenage girl is having sex education, and the teenage boys, then you're talking about parental involvement as an intervening variable as well. Cultural trends is probably justifiable like X3 here and has a direct relationship to Y. So you may want to actually leave cultural trends out of this study, because then you're introducing another independent variable, and that gets things a little complicated. So put that on the table for another study. So that's how I would put your research model together, Natasha, is I would argue that it was part of this model here, where you have one independent variable correlated to your dependent variable with two intervening variables that are both associated with improving sex education. One of them being access to contraceptives, and the other one being improving communication with parents. Jonathan and Leah, I believe both of you had done studies very similar to what I focused on as far as sex education, and so I hope that was instructive for you, both Jonathan and Leah. Okay, the next one up that I have is Vanessa's. Vanessa talked about the Black youth struggle. This is something that I'm very familiar with from my work in Liberty City, and it really struck close to home. Black youth have always had, being my husband's African American, as you probably all remember, so black youth have always had this struggle of whether they should be loyal to this country or not. The United States has not done a lot of good things for black males. Or black females for that matter, but especially black males are getting the bad rap. And so why should black youth especially have this loyalty to America? And so this idea that we can intervene with that, it comes from policies. So if we look at the black youth struggle as the dependent variable, what can we do to lessen? So we want to reduce how much black youth struggle to identify with and with America, with American culture. Can they call this country their own? Does this country do the same thing for them and treat them as fairly as every other young person? And the answer obviously right now is no. So we want to improve how black youth feel toward this country, and we want to improve that the way that they feel this country is treating them the same as all other youth. So policies, definitely, the political influence, there need to be policy changes. That's what my entire dissertation is focusing on, is changing policy. So X1 would be policy change. But we also need to deal with the media portrayal of black youth. And so now we're talking about two very, very different independent variables. So you've gone with the idea of self-esteem, and so what I would do is I would leave politics out of this one here. And I would argue that we can, let's just put politics off for Professor Leavitt's dissertation, because he's going to deal with policy and policy change. Let's talk about media portrayal for a very simple study here. Media portrayal of black youth. And then let's talk about how that can impact self-esteem. So if the media portrayal, it will have a direct relationship to the dependent variable on how black youth struggle. And so there is a direct relationship between the media portrayal of black youth and how much they struggle. But there also is a correlation, as you pointed out, Vanessa, in the self-esteem that black youth feel. And so media portrayal of black youth will affect the self-esteem of black youth. And so the model, which I think is which would work here as well. So actually, this model here, I designed it for you so that we can leave policy up here, policy change as X1, and X2 would be the media portrayal of black youth, which would be impacting the self-esteem. But we could also put an arrow directly from X2 all the way over to Y. And so we could drop policy out and study these X2 and X3 and their relationship to the dependent variable as a study as well. So we can leave policy out. Next one up is Brenda Mortimer. Brenda, you talked about poor childhood education outcomes, and specifically related to how divorce rates impact and are correlated to having poor childhood educational outcomes. So as the dependent variable, we've got educational outcomes. We don't put a direction on a dependent variable. We just say educational outcomes for children. And they can go up or it can go down. So if it's going down, we've got poor education outcomes, and if it's improving, then it's going up, and we've got good. So we don't want to imply any direction. We just want to say educational outcomes would be your dependent variable. And so you have argued that for X1, your work and article focused mostly on divorce rates. And you argued very, very effectively that the most ideal situation for a young person is to have a father and a mother figure in their home. As a gay man, I would argue that two parents in a home, doesn't have to be a mother and a father, but a two-parent family meets all of the requirements that you outlined in your research article here. So a two-parent family would be much better suited to helping a child have good educational outcomes. And there's no denying that. All of the research supports that, so we can leave that off the table. And so it's kind of a moot point here to say that divorce is going to impact childhood education outcomes, because all of the research already shows that. There's really nothing new to discover about divorce causing poor educational outcomes for children. And so what I would argue for you in this situation is, since we know that we want to, in order to have improved childhood educational outcomes, we need to stop the divorce rate. We need to slow the divorce rate and reverse this climbing divorce rate. So instead of focusing on childhood educational outcomes, why don't we focus on, and your research already did focus on, making marriages happier. So if we could keep both parents in the house with their children, both biological parents in the house with their children throughout the entire upbringing of children, then that would be the best way of improving their educational outcomes. So let's focus on what it takes to be happy in a marriage. And you mentioned some of these issues, the societal stressors. And the outcome of this is, if we don't necessarily focus on what it takes to make a couple happy, and instead focus on what it takes to make a parent happy more often. If these parents, doesn't matter if they're single, doesn't matter if they're divorced, doesn't matter if they are on a second marriage, if these parents are happier, then we're going to improve the educational outcomes of their children. So let's focus on, as a research project, rather than rehash the old idea that divorce rates are bad for children and educational outcomes. Nothing new to be learned there. So let's focus on what makes society better and support these parents. So why don't we as a society focus on supporting these parents? And so then we've all of a sudden got a whole separate, different set of variables, and we move X1, which was in your case the divorce rate. We move the divorce rate into the middle of this model here and create the new dependent variable out of parental happiness. And that way we can really work on research that you may have something to contribute to improving childhood educational outcomes by improving the happiness of parents. And then that means removing stressors from parents. And these stressors are what cause divorces. If you're dealing with financial issues, if you're unemployed, if you want to go back to school and you can't because society is not supporting people with children to return back to school, why don't we talk about ways that we can support parents who need to go back to school so that they can be better off financially, so that they can get on a job that has a healthcare plan, so that their children are raised with healthcare plans, and so that the financial stresses, and why don't we talk about stresses in the inner city so that the single mothers who are already out there in society in the inner city have a better chance at improving their lives. And why don't we work with these inner city single mothers to teach them how to pursue long-term relationships, and so that they can shop around for better men who are going to be more likely to hang around and raise the children with them. And why don't we focus on the young men in the inner cities so that they don't have this prestige to being a baby daddy and having baby mamas all over the inner city. If these are the issues that we are talking about that are producing poor childhood educational outcomes, then these are the issues that we should focus on. So that's why sometimes when you start research, you end up moving your dependent variable off the map and finding the new dependent variable as one of what you originally thought was your independent variable. So there's a few of you who have done this as well. One of you was Norman. You had something very similar to this. You talked about the Veterans Administration problems. There's just enormous amounts of problems in the Veterans Administration. But that, if that's the old why, I would argue for your research project, you could focus on a new why, which you named as one of the strongest arguments you presented in your research project was about policy failures and funding failures. So there's tons and tons of problems in the Veterans Administration, but almost all of them can be connected to bad policy, and specifically bad policy that is depriving them of the proper funding that they need so that they could fix their problems if they had the money. Every one of the problems in the Veterans Administration is a problem that could be fixed with money and better policy to support it, but we don't have political will. So why don't we move this policy problems in as your new dependent variable, which you originally thought of as an independent variable. So why don't we move that independent variable in as a dependent variable and start talking about ways that we can change the policy failures in the administration. And you talked about the military-industrial complex, which puts all of the focus on building new military hardware and puts no focus on dealing with the veterans once they're home from a war. The constant war and conflict, it doesn't focus. So if we could focus on improving dialogue with non-military intervention when there is a conflict, rather than sending U.S. soldiers over in harm's way, which spends money on a war and denies the money to the veterans who've already served in wars. And you talked about the global hegemon, and so the global hegemon is also this issue that says we want all new wars, and when the veterans go home, we just ignore them because they're out of sight. And the need for bipartisan support is also something. So I would argue that this would also fix yours, Norman. I'm going to back up to this slide here. Remember, we started here. How will it be operationalized? So what we've been talking about here is actually operationalizing this. Once you pinpoint a unit of analysis, then you say, oh, okay, I know what I've got in mind. I want to measure the effectiveness of the Veterans Administration. So you're going to have to get much more focused on that if you're going to look at the individual units of a Veterans Affairs, hospitals, or the post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. Those kinds of that kind of focusing is going to be important eventually. So moving on down here, that's how you operationalize it. You look for a direct link, and so some of the examples that I'm going to get to now are talking about this, where there has been a failing to actually establish a direct link between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And what we've talked about here as well in the previous example, and we're going to do one more example of it, is should you back up one layer? And this is what I'm talking about in the causal change. So what you originally thought of as your dependent variable, now you became more interested, and there's certain, and this is where operationalizing comes in. When you look at operationalizing your research, you may actually find that you need to back up one level, one layer in this causal chain. So from the idea of the Veterans Affairs problems to the actual policy problems within Congress. And so that allows you to refocus. And so that's part of the operationalizing process that you have to go through. And establishing the direct link, and where does your proposed solution fit in. So that's what we're going to talk about here. Where does your proposed solution fit in these models? And that's where we move back one layer if we have to, or we determine that there is no direct link, and we have to add something in. So that's the issues here that we're going to be dealing with. Let's get back to this model here and talk about Tim's example. Tim was talking about global warming, and how global warming is actually, climate change is melting the polar ice caps. The particular story that Tim looked up was about where this entire shelf is going to break off from the Antarctic. And when that entire shelf breaks off and floats away from the cold climate of the Antarctic, it's going to melt. And it's such an enormous shelf that when it does melt, it's actually going to contribute to the rising of the sea levels to a much larger degree over the next 100, 200 years than what we originally anticipated might have been. And the worst case scenario just got worse. So the idea that the polar ice caps was the dependent variable on a model more like this one here, the idea that the polar ice caps were going to melt was caused by global warming. And so our X1 in that example was global warming. But that's, once again, that's already, science has pretty much come to the conclusion that that's going to happen. Global warming is going to cause the polar ice caps to melt. So let's just look at global warming now. And that's where we have to back up one layer and start using this other table, where the new dependent variable becomes global warming, because global warming is by default going to cause the ice caps to melt. So now what Tim was looking at and the variables that he mentioned now, we can start with this model here where global warming is the new y. We can look at this model here where possibly three different things have a direct correlation to. And remember when we looked at, this is what we're going to be talking about here, our fifth point here mentions, is there a direct link between the two? So that's why we're going to look at this table here, this model here. And we're going to see, okay, all three of these have a direct link, but is that really the case? And the models and the direct links which Tim suggested were leading to global warming. So we've got our new y, which is global warming, and the direct links that Tim mentioned were the science deniers. This is the big factor, that certain individuals who are electing people to Congress in the United States and in other countries are denying that climate change is man-made. But that just causes my head to shake in disbelief, because even if it isn't man-made, it's still global warming. Okay, so it's still going to melt the ice caps even if it isn't man-made. But can we? So do we just continue to burn coal, and which is the largest contributor to carbon monoxide and the global warming? And say, well, we're going to have climate change anyway, so let's continue to burn coal. So that is the science deniers, and that's what the first one that Tim mentioned. The other one is a reliance on fossil fuels. We don't have to burn fossil fuels in order to heat our homes and have electricity. We have solar power, we have wind power, we have tidal power. So we can diversify and burn less fossil fuels. But once again, that relates back to the science deniers. So is the burning of fossil fuels directly related, or is it an intervening variable? Or do science deniers lead to the burning? So maybe we just have to put an arrow in between x1 and x2, and we can leave the arrow between x2 and y where it is. The other one which Tim mentioned was the industrialized age. And he added two variables onto here. So this is getting a very complex model. And so this is one thing that we have to think about. Where does your proposed solution fit in? Okay, the second to the bottom on this table here, where does your proposed solution fit in? Which solution are you proposing? So when we get back to Tim's model here, the industrialized age is his X3. This is what he suggested as his X3. But he's got two feeding factors into the industrial age. Where we are already in the developed world, we have excessive lifestyles. The United States has a certain percentage of the population of the world, but we use far, far, far in excess of the most energy of any population in the world per capita than anybody else. But the rest of the country, so this is one feeding factor that's going into X3 that Tim mentioned. And the other one is developing countries are also becoming more wealthy, and they want what we have, so they want to reach the level of consumption, excessive consumption, that the United States already enjoys. And so they're buying automobiles, and they're burning fossil fuels, and they're getting light and more electrical appliances in their homes, so they need more electricity. And so this pressure of the industrialized age now reaching the developing world is contributing to this as well. So where does your proposed solution fit in? And so this is where this research model, as Tim proposed it, needs to be pared down a little bit. And I would suggest that you focus Tim on focus on the science deniers and the fossil fuels, and the industrialized age and excessive lifestyles is another research project unto itself. because it's going to muddy this one up way too much. Next person up is Samantha. Samantha was talking about socioeconomic status and physical health. And this is a case where we've got two independent variables, and a couple of you have mentioned research models where you've got two independent variables. Samantha, you've mentioned the idea that a low socioeconomic status, people of low socioeconomic status, have poor physical health because they have fewer opportunities to socialize with friends, and you argued that this desire or need, and it's very much a need. It's not just desire; it's a need to impress our friends. So what we want to do is, as a gay man, I want to look good because I know what I want in a gay. I know what I like in other men, and so I desire to be that kind of a person. So I push myself to stay in good shape, and I keep my weight down, and I try and stay athletic. Because I know that those are traits that I desire in other men as a gay man. So in the gay community, we already have this built-in pressure which heterosexual men don't deal with quite as much because they're trying to impress women and they can't imagine what women like, and so they feel less pressure to become. So the research suggests that they feel less pressure to have that ideal body that gay men feel because we desire to impress other men ourselves. And so this is what low socioeconomic status, and this is what Samantha argues, is that when you are in a situation where you are of low socioeconomic status, number one, your circle of friends are not those kinds of friends where there is that pressure to keep up to the Joneses, as they say. And so this physical health deteriorates with low socioeconomic status because you are trying. There are fewer people in the world that you have to impress, and so you just kind of go into this, and this is where Samantha argues, you go into this mental depression because you don't have friends that you don't have as many friends because low socioeconomic status prevents you from getting out as much, prevents you from interacting as much with other people. You don't have as many opportunities. If you're unemployed, you're not going to work every day where you deal with peers. And it's easier to stay in the house all day and become depressed, and so this cycle goes downward where your physical health and your mental health goes down. And this is where you got into a problem, Samantha, is that you named at this point two dependent variables. So if we look at this model here, which I think is the most appropriate, you've got two Y's. One Y is physical health and one Y is mental health. And you could argue that these are poor health outcomes. And generically speaking, all health outcomes are poor when you are of low socioeconomic status. So your X1 is undeniably low socioeconomic status. But your dependent variable probably should be refined to either physical health in one study and mental health in another study. But you could argue both if you just said poor health just health outcomes. And once again, don't put poor, don't put the qualifier poor in the title of your dependent variable, because poor is a decreasing health outcome and improving is the other direction. So we can either improve health outcomes or we can deteriorate health outcomes, but either way the dependent variable is health outcomes, no qualifier. So in that case you argued that an intervening variable was the number of friends, and there may be arguing that there should be an arrow back and forth between X1 and X2 if the number of friends is related to low socioeconomic status. So because you are of a low socioeconomic status and because you have fewer friends, they relate to each other, but the fewer friends is also impacting your health outcomes, both physically because you don't have a motive to work out and stay in good shape, and mentally because you spiral down into this depression. And then the loneliness comes in specifically, and this is where I believe loneliness would only come into play for poor mental health outcomes, because loneliness is what causes that spiral to do the depression. So I would stick with either physical health or mental health on your study, because then you can use that third intervening variable of loneliness when you investigate the mental health outcomes. I don't think loneliness has a physical health outcome by itself, but if you want to argue that, then that's fine. I would go ahead and do that. Okay, Marina is up next. Marina argued for the violence towards Jews. Now the interesting thing here about Marina's research proposal was that it was a lack of Holocaust education was an independent variable. So I'll leave this model up here. If Marina's argument is that when you have little or no education about the Holocaust, then the extension of that is that people are not going to have a full understanding of where that kind of behavior that allowed the Holocaust to happen. And if you've never been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., as part of the Smithsonian Museums, I would highly recommend that you go, because the message that you leave with from the Holocaust Museum is that there was a certain mindset that took place there where millions and millions of people became complicit in the murder and genocide of not just the Jews, but the Roma and the homosexuals and the anybody else that was deemed to be an inferior race. And so this genocide of anything that was not Aryan race only took place because they convinced people through propaganda that there was a benefit to them. They were going to enjoy additional privileges if they not necessarily participated, but if they actually turned a blind eye and just allowed it to happen. The narrative was that you had to be a good German, and a good German will allow the Nazis to do what they did. And so this is how the Holocaust happened. So the lack of Holocaust education does have ramifications, and it does cause, there is a correlation of, if you do not educate people about the Holocaust, then there are going to be consequences, because that is one of the most instructive elements of human history that we have available to us to indicate and to train young people that complicity is every bit as much of a crime. You will go to jail for complicity if you know of a friend's intention to murder somebody and you just say, well, you know what, yeah, he told me he's going to go kill this guy, but you know what, it's his problem, I'm going to let him just go ahead and do it. If they can prove that, you will go to jail for complicity. It is a crime to be complicit in other people's crimes. And so, as a failure to teach people about Holocaust education, as a failure to include really accurate information about the Holocaust in education, in public education, there will be consequences. Marina's argument is that that this would cause, and Marina's model here said that the lack of education would lead to, let me use one here as an example. Marina's model was kind of like this one here, where she said lack of Holocaust education will lead to an increasing rate of anti-Semitism, feelings of anti-Semitism, which leads to the violence toward Jews. And so what we've got here is we've got two research models, because we've got this extension that goes from one variable into another variable, which is into another variable. And so that's a poor research model, because you can't have, well, as it says here on this, is there a direct link between the two? The fifth item here, is there a direct link between the two? No, there is not a direct link between the two in Marina's model here, because we've got a variable in the middle, and you can't have an independent variable impacting another independent variable impacting a dependent variable, because this is a dependent variable on this independent variable, but this is a dependent variable on this as an independent variable, and so this thing in the middle here is really getting in the way. So there's no direct link. So we have to actually figure out a way to operationalize something that connects the lack of Holocaust education to violence towards Jews. My recommendation for Marina to do this would be to actually argue that lack of Holocaust education and the rate of anti-Semitism would be the X3 in this model. Just ignore the last Y over here and we'll just go with this new Y. And so we have two independent variables that have a relationship with each other. So I would put an arrow in between the X2 and the X3 here. And the dependent variable would be the violence towards Jews. So if you have a high rate of anti-Semitism and you have very low education standards for teaching young people about the Holocaust, then this will lead to increased behavior of X3, but the two together will compound and have a higher increasing rate of violence towards Jews. So that would be the way to operationalize this. But you're going to have to watch the intervening, the relationship that these two have with each other, and that you may have to separate it out into two research projects in order to isolate one from the other. Because if you can't isolate X2 from X3, then you're still not going to know what's causing the higher rate of it. You'll know that something's causing a higher rate of Y, which is your violence towards Jews, but you're not going to isolate which one it is, whether it's the lack of education or an already increasing rate of violence towards Jews. Judith went off on an interesting article. And I think every semester I've had somebody talk about homeless people and what causes high rates of homelessness. And what Judith isolated was the idea that there are 7 myths about homeless people, and every one of them are a very, very good research project. But what you've got here is homeless people is named as an independent variable in this model here. Let me just hold that up to the camera a little closer. And when you have homeless people named as an independent variable, let's go back to this model here. So if we've got homeless people as the independent variable, then you've got consequences which research supports or either fails to support. And what Judith is arguing is that there are 7 things which homelessness, a high rate of homelessness, is not correlated to as a dependent variable. And it was an excellent article because what it does is it says homelessness, high rates of homelessness is not connected to this, or this. And homeless people do not all live on the streets. Some of them live in their cars. Homelessness is not always related to mental illness. So if you are mentally ill, you are not necessarily homeless. And if you are homeless, you are not necessarily mentally ill. Homeless people do not choose to be homeless. Homeless people only want food and money. This is another myth. Homeless people need a lot more than food and money. Homeless people don't take care of themselves. Well, as Judith pointed out, homeless people quite often have gym memberships. They can't afford a mortgage, but they can afford a gym membership so that they can get in and shower and keep fit and at least have that benefit of a bathroom. So they can afford a gym membership in order to stay clean and take care of themselves. And one thing which I really want to go off on is and take it as a research project unto itself is homeless people need help taking care of their pets. Quite often homeless people will keep a pet that will alert them so that the belongings that they are carrying with them are not put at risk. And so a pet is their companionship, it's their one connection to another human being that they can take care of. Because they can't necessarily take care of themselves, but they want to take care of another companion. And so this pet becomes that. And I worked in the pet project for pets in Broward County, trying to allow terminally ill people to keep their pets when their income failed and their expenses for medical expenses go right through the roof. We, as the pet project for pets, would supply them with everything they needed in order to keep their pet. And so this becomes a research project. So homeless people and the reliance on companion animals is a research project unto itself. And so that's where I would focus on. The 7 myths can go into your research project and say, you know what, these are also part and parcel of it, but these are not the focus of this research project. This research project is going to focus on the benefits of having a companion animal to a homeless person. So if we look at companion animals and homeless people and the homelessness, what we can do is we can look at an independent variable of companion animals, the presence of companion animals, and the well-being of homeless people being able to cope with the deprivations of being homeless. And so the ability to cope, or the healthy outcomes or improved outcomes from companion animals, would be a research project by itself. Intervening variables would be availability of vet care. Another intervening variable would be the availability of proper nutrition for the pet, so that whatever the homeless person is able to secure, they don't have to worry about taking care of their animal. So if the soup truck, if the portable soup truck that went out to take care of homeless people in Broward County by the library, which is where they go every night at about 6:30 and take a warm meal to the homeless people who accumulate there at the public library. If they also took pet food so that the animals, the companion animals, were actually taken care of as well, would that improve the state of and mental health and other concerns for the homeless people? Rita wanted to research and examine what the impact has been since the 1964 Civil Rights Act on the black share of public spending from states and local governments. Her dependent variable then was the share of public spending that went to black communities and black citizens from states and local governments. Her independent variable that she's arguing is the enforcement of the Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act of 1964. And whether that has a voter turnout, whether it decreases voter turnout. And if you have decreasing voter turnout as an intervening variable, so I argue here that increasing voter turnout is an intervening variable, or decreasing, so voter turnout of black individuals would be our X2. And the redistricting rules that favor access, which black individuals and visual minorities have to polling stations and other facilities that help in making voting easier. So if there is an ID requirement, does redistricting make those locations inaccessible to black individuals and minorities? So the three independent variables, the independent variable becomes the black voting rights Section 4B enforcement, or the inability to enforce Voting Rights Act of 1964 with Section 4B gone. And then the X2 is the voter turnout, whether it increases or decreases as an intervening variable on that. And then the redistricting rules. So that was a complicated one. I may have to work with you individually on Rita if you want, with Rita, if you want to use that for your research project. Anna Marie, you wrote about the, is there an increase in student suicide? The connection between cyberbullying and teenage or adolescent suicide rates. And so we've seen several examples, very, very high profile cases in the media of cyberbullying where a young person committed suicide. So does cyberbullying actually increase the rate of suicide? And if it does, this is a classic case of an intervening variable. We know that cyberbullying has been connected to or correlated to a certain number of suicides. So the intervening variable was that we want to, and this is where the solution comes in. Remember we talked about, on the second to the last point here, it says, where does your proposed solution fit in? And Anna Maria's gives us an excellent example to illustrate this. Where Anna Maria's solutions are with this X2 and X3. The idea that we've already established this correlation between cyberbullying and suicides among young people is there. And so the as the researcher that Anna Maria cited in her work said, societal models in America today and in our culture today are hostile, abusive, and discriminatory. And so these solutions which Anna Maria has put forward in her research paper, or she's indicated that they are there, are ideas of regulating, number one, regulating the industry so that the cyberbullying can be curtailed, and also to put in some instructional methods in there so that we reinterpret our societal norms so that we can help our children, and so that school teachers and other community workers can work with children to help them see that what they see in Hollywood movies and what they see on television does not necessarily have to be the case. It's an unreal portrayal of what life is really like. And to help them interpret that hostile environment, the abusive environment, and the discriminatory behavior, which manifests itself in social media so much and on television. So there are solutions, and that's where the solutions come in. We introduce these solutions as intervening variables, which is the ideal research methodology, which I really want you to pursue. Is here is a causal link, and here's what I propose we change. And those are what the intervening variables stand for. Lastly, we have the research project by Gabrielle, and she was talking about in-state tuition being approved now for undocumented immigrants. Because the Florida legislature got this passed, it is nothing short of miraculous because there was so much opposition to it. And so, Gabrielle, what you've done in your research is you've isolated, and I really haven't got a good grasp on where you want to go with it, because there's two very, very different directions that you can go with your research. And this is why it's very important for all of you students to look at these articles which you found intriguing to you and pick out from them something that is actually narrow enough and tailored with a very narrow focus so that you can actually research it without getting too much other material in there. Gabrielle, you've got two directions you can go with this. You talk a lot in your model about, in your diagram here, about a divided Florida Senate, but this divided Florida Senate actually was able to come up with the in-state tuition approval for undocumented young people, undocumented people, period, but particularly young people, to have in-state tuition. The goal, of course, the only reason why the Senate would have approved this is that because it will be beneficial to Florida to have these young people more educated, more employable, earning higher income, and paying taxes on higher income. And so the goal is that with in-state tuition we're going to have more of these young undocumented citizens enroll and continue on in university. That's the goal. That's why they did it. They wouldn't have done it for any other reason. And so I'm not sure what direction, Gabi, you were going with your research as to whether we needed to fix the Senate so that we could get more legislation like this passed, or whether we needed to now start looking at, now that these undocumented citizens are allowed to enjoy in-state tuition, what we can do to actually get them to enroll more, get more of them to enroll in university and take advantage of it now. And this is the important part about identifying your passion. Because all of us, it's human nature, and even for me, it's very, very difficult to focus myself on something like this where there's two very, very interesting directions to go, but you have to pick just one. You cannot research the impact of a toxic politics and this ideological divide that we suffer with in today's politics, and the undocumented young people now taking advantage of in-state tuition. Both of them are very interesting. So you have to narrow that down, and that's the importance of this list that I gave you here. So I'm just going to close by talking about this list. Going back again, do you have only one dependent variable? Have you, if you've got that's the absolute critical starting point. Once you have that, you can identify your population of interest, you can identify your unit of analysis, and then with the population of interest and the unit of analysis, you can operationalize it. And this is where you're going to recognize all of your flaws and you're going to do a lot of revisions when you actually try and operationalize your research. How can you, and that's where this model comes in. This model actually helps you operationalize it. Is it an intervening variable? Is there a direct link between the two variables that you've mentioned, or is there something in the middle there that's going to interfere with your research? If there is, you can't operationalize it. So think in your mind very, very clearly, and for me it only comes because I write. So as I start writing about how I'm going to operationalize this, you actually, whether you think in bullet points or whether you think in paragraphs or whether you think in narratives, as you start to write, you're going to say, oh crap, that's not going to work. And that's the idea of identifying all of these problems once you start to try and operationalize it. So where does your proposed solution fit in? Your proposed solution should be, in most cases, an intervening variable, which is why I use this model here. Because X2 and X3 are where you will work with your proposed solution. And because what you've recognized is this causal, what you've recognized is the correlation between X1 and Y. And what you're going to propose is that you're going to intervene in that relationship to come up with a more favorable direction of movement in Y, your population of interest. And so that's how you operationalize. That's the whole idea of operationalizing it. Where does your proposed solution fit in? Once you identify where your proposed solution fits in, you're on your way home. That's when your research project can be finished. And that's why I do the research project as an outline first, as an almost finished draft, as a presentation, because by the time you've done through those 3 things, you're now going to have a very clear understanding of where your proposed solution fits in, and then you can finish and write your conclusion, and that's where we have to come back to. And that's really the objective of the whole course, is to be able to do that, to get your proposed solution to fit in. Thanks so much for watching.